Hi, welcome to Innovative Leaders Driving Thriving Organizations. I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf, and today we're joined by Paul Gibbons. Paul works at the nexus of science and leadership, philosophy and business, with 30 years of business experience, including investment banking, consulting, entrepreneurship, and university teaching. Today, Paul will talk about his book, focusing on large-scale change, and also on the concepts of agility and anti-fragile. So, Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
My enormous pleasure, Maureen. Hello.
It's fascinating. You and I have slightly different paths, but certainly a passion around organizational change.
For human beings to change and for businesses to change, there need to be more than just good reasons. It needs to be more than facts. It needs to be more than science. One of the things that's important for us as human beings and as a society and in businesses is to determine a way how to break up the routines which are getting in the way of prosperity and human flourishing. So habits is one of the things I became really passionate about during the 1990s. And there's been some great research in the last 5 years. Psychologists talk about schema, which are psychological scripts that run automatically. It also links into another topic, of course, that I pick up in the book, which is mindfulness, because in order to be conscious, you need to, moment by moment, bring a level of consciousness to what you're doing in order that you're able to alter the trajectory of what you're doing. Well, that might be driving to work, but it also might be behavioral stuff around eating or around smoking, but it also can be around executives and around leadership. You need to bring, in a sense, all of the automaticity that has been your friend up until then. You need to be able to disrupt that. And to have that choice, you need to have awareness. So we sometimes say that choice follows awareness. You cannot choose where you're not aware of the behavior or not conscious of it. So a lot of the interesting research on mindfulness has shown that it allows people to, in a sense, disrupt that automaticity more easily and to identify that they might be making a wrong choice. And that choice can be trivial, like driving to work, or it can be, of course, much more important.
So let's get into the book. I find each of these topics fascinating, and it'd be easy to go off into a bit of a tangent. So why did you write the book, and what are the biggest takeaways that you would like our listeners to understand from this short conversation?
Well, I wrote it, it's one of these things. I set out to write a book in 3 or 4 months. That would be the ABCs of change management. So I'd wanted to write a book for a very long time. I was one of these people who, I could have been an author, or I should have been an author, or I have a book on me, or had some sort of unfulfilled ambition in that direction. And so finally, I said, I'm just going to write the easiest book that I can write, which is a book on the standard basics of change management. And it's going to take 3 months. Well, the book took me 2 years. And inside the book is something that's far, far from the basics of change management. In fact, there's almost nothing about the basics of change management in the book. If you want, it's a very advanced treatment of change management. And so how it became that way is, as I began to say to myself, well, I'll just put in some interesting research from the behavioral sciences on cognitive biases, or let me put in some research on habits, or let me put on some research from change agility, or let me introduce Nassim Taleb's work on anti-fragility, or let me indeed introduce C. Aldini's work on influencing. And so what began as a very ABCs book on change management really became a tour through what I think are the most important writers in the last decade. They're not change management writers. They tend to be psychologists or philosophers or scientists or neuroscientists. But how can I take all of the great learning that we have from the behavioral sciences in the last decade and, in a sense, try and help change management, the dark arts of change management, catch up? And so that was what the book became, was my attempt, if you will, to bring change management into the 21st century with all of the great science that we've discovering about human beings in the last 15 years or so.
So let's jump right into what are the biggest ideas from the book that you want our listeners to pay attention to and walk away with, since really a lot of the focus of this show is giving listeners practical tools that they can implement in their regular lives, regular business, organizational, leadership lives.
Well, let me start with cognitive biases. I fell in love with the writings of an author called Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And so several years ago, I became an ardent student of things called cognitive biases. So if you look on Wikipedia, there are hundreds of cognitive biases that psychologists and other people who study human behavior have diagnosed. So what's a cognitive bias? It's a systematic mistake that human beings make in solving problems, if you want. And so one of the chapters in the book is devoted to how executive teams, by becoming more conscious of their cognitive biases, can make better leadership decisions.
So how is that different from or aligned with mindfulness?
Well, both mindfulness is certainly one of the benefits of mindfulness is increased in the moment choice. But in addition to that, having that choice, you need to know the ways in which you're systematically making mistakes. So, for example, one of the biases that human beings talk about, and I think every single listener will be familiar with, is called the planning fallacy. And so we all grotesquely underestimate in our day-to-day lives how long something is going to take. And that happens all the time. I think as a consultant, Maureen, I think you'll be familiar with the fact that you do it sometimes, and even clients do it sometimes. And we live in this world where the effect of that planning fallacy is due to something called the sunk cost fallacy, which is once we've invested effort in something, we do not want to, no matter how badly things are going, abandon our efforts. So, for example, the sunk cost fallacy takes us to the Vietnam War, where it was clear that it was going to be a losing proposition for the United States. However, the argument was that to leave the Vietnam War would be doing a disservice or an injustice to the men who had already given their lives. But from a rational point of view, it's a very sad thing, but those men have already departed. We can't do anything about that. So to take those lost lives into our calculation, the important calculation is how many more will be lost and the other costs of war in the future. And so human beings do that all with investments, for example. So once an investment falls, human beings are less inclined to sell it than they are to take a profit. And because psychologically, what we require is some justification that we were right in the first place. None of us likes to admit we were wrong. So with the sunk cost fallacy and the planning fallacy together, you have two things that are very interesting if you're undertaking major change, and sometimes change might be as small as $1 million or $2 million project. And sometimes, I know consultants for IBM who manage change programs which are a decade long and cost $20 or $30 billion. So these two things, the sunk cost fallacy and the planning fallacy, are extraordinarily costly to organizations and, of course, in people's own lives. So those are two of the important biases in the book.
So I'm thinking of instances where this comes into play where I'm working on a project that at the outset seemed like a brilliant idea. The world has changed, so it's not that there was poor thinking in selecting that project, but as a competitor introduces a new project or a product or something hugely significant like a recession hits, then my direction also needs to pivot. And what I hear you saying is my cognitive bias will cause me to stay the course when in fact I should be changing course pretty quickly.
Yeah, you'll double down in a way rather than run for cover. I mean, people do it in relationships too. I mean, all the time. Now that's another example. People do it with money pit houses and money pit cars. I can't possibly sell this thing because I just put $1,000 into it. And of course, if you own a lousy car and you put $1,000, so what you ought to do is sell a lousy car. Because they do become money pits. But if you've just spent $1,000 on a new brake, so you think, I'll just drive it a little longer. So that sunk cost calculation happens also in relationships and happens in projects. And it can be very emotionally challenging to let go of something where you've made a big investment. But from a rational point of view, what matters is what you're going to get out of it, not what you've put into it. The paradigm around change right now is that change is the exception, that organizations are static, and then change comes along. And that's just not the reality. So the reality is it's all change always. From a new member of the department to someone retiring to a reorganization to someone getting promoted to the micro level changes all the way up to billion and dollar change programs, right? Change is part of every manager's day job. And it might be inaccurate to say that 80% of every manager's job is change, but certainly 80% of the headaches of every manager are dealing with organizational changes. I think most people would nod at that. They say 50% of statistics are made up on the moment. So in a way, that's not empirically justified. But when you talk to managers day in and day out, most of what keeps them awake at night is how do they cope with changes or how do they enact changes themselves. So here's our question then. Why are we teaching managers that change is the exception? Because if something is supposed to be an exception to the norm, it's received as a disruption to the status quo. But in a sense, we don't have a status quo. It's all change always. The pre-BCE philosopher Heraclitus said, you cannot step into the same river twice. And by that, he meant that everything is always changing, that life is a series of flows and fluxes. And this notion of stability or this notion of equilibrium, one of the things that economists talk about, equilibrium, they're fantasies. The world isn't like that. And so when our mindset is fixed on the notion that life should be different than it is, life should be static, I shouldn't have this project to deal with, we are not equipping people psychologically. We're also not equipping them, Maureen, I don't think, in terms of the education we give managers. So one of the things I did in the book was study MBA programs to see what's the level of change education. Let's take a 35-year-old senior manager or a 40-year-old young director. How much change education have they received by the time they get to these important places in their organization? If you look at a Harvard MBA, there are 16 mandatory modules and there are 100 electives. And of all of that, only one of those is a brief module on change management, if you want, or leading change. Now, I find that an extraordinary thing. Because if you accept the hypothesis that 80% of what managers do is manager-lead change, then to have it be a fraction, less than 1% of what's a standard management education, a standard business school education, we're equipping people very, very poorly. And I think, again, we're treating the business world as if it's a static entity and business as if they're a static entity, and that change is episodic, is the word I use in the book. Whereas it's constant, and we need to be equipping every manager in every organization with a minimal set of change competencies so that they can, in a sense, create this agile organization. Because change management, the firefighting that I've done when I've been called into a project, usually a year after the project's begun, and people are walking out and downing tools in with anxiety or anger at some change that's not going particularly well, they often ask somebody like me to come in and sprinkle my change pixie dust on the workers to make them happier with the changes that the senior execs are trying to drive through. So and in a way, I'm a Band-Aid in that. I'm a Band-Aid and a useful and sometimes well-paid Band-Aid, I want to add, but a Band-Aid to help leaders and managers do things that they ought to be good at doing by themselves. They ought to be a 35-year-old senior manager or a 40-year-old young director ought to be competent at leading his team and leading his organization for change. They ought to be competent at managing that kind of complexity. And we ought to be giving people the tools to manage conflict, to negotiate, to engage stakeholders, to inspire stakeholders, all of the things that are in the day-to-day armory of change experts, such as yourself, I think ought to be in the armory of the standard, work-a-day, 35-year-old manager. And so that's part of the answer, I think, to change agility is we want to equip the whole organization with the sorts of skills that now only reside with specialists. Some people accuse me of writing a book that's like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much, there's entire books written on mindfulness, and it's a third of a chapter. There's an entire book on changing habits, and I've consigned that to a third of a chapter. There's an entire book on cognitive biases, and that's a third of a chapter. So in a sense, I'm going to go through some very complex ideas very quickly. We do things in organizations because a guru proposes that it might be the right thing. Or we do things in organizations because we're good at them. Or we do things because they're a habit in organizations. And so evidence-based management is, in a sense, a clarion call to start to evaluate empirically the results of our interventions in organizations so that we're making better and better choices. So it originated in medicine, but now there's a whole field of evidence-based policy, and I'm excited to say there's a field now of evidence-based management, which looks at the effectiveness of our policies so that we can make better choices. And people say, well, what are the bad choices we're making? I'll give a very easy example. The way we select workers, I've been interviewed for jobs that pay large six-figure sums, and largely the method that they use to select workers is something called the unstructured interview or the chat interview. And that has almost no predictive power. So organizational psychologists have studied this in enormous detail, and those conversations, which are at the meat of most of how people are hired, are almost unpredictive of how successful someone will be in role. So that's a fascinating thing. That means 90% of what we're doing in the recruitment process is a waste of time and money. And as I said, in my own experience, I've been interviewed for, so over my long career, dozens of, very big ticket jobs. And almost all of the selection procedure has been based around something that's no more predictive than astrology. And so that's, in a sense, the opposite of evidence-based management. How do we continue to do things that fly in the face of what organizational science says is the right thing? And so readers will find a chapter on evidence-based management, because I think it's one of the great things, the great hopes for the 21st century is running more efficient organizations based on what science tells us is the correct way to proceed.
Paul's book is The Science of Organizational Change. I hope you've heard something in today's conversation that you can take away beyond purchasing Paul's book that you might be able to apply quickly. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be with you again next week.